Sanding is fun. It's just really, really enjoyable. I love it. I mean, who doesn't like pushing a bunch of rocks across wood 700,000 times until it's smooth? It's great. What I'd really like to do someday is go out and buy some wood, bring it back to the shop, and just sand. I mean, hopefully I sand enough that it eventually turns into a chair or an epoxy river table, but I'm mainly in it for the sanding. It's the best part of woodworking. Let's be honest, everybody hates sanding, but it's one of those things that's absolutely required to get a professional looking project. So let's talk about the most common tools involved with sanding. The first is a plain old sanding block. Now these come in preformed plastic blocks or disposable blocks that you just sort of use and then throw away. I've got a preformed sanding block made of rubber, and it's got nails sticking out of each end, and that's where you hook the sandpaper. You can use sandpaper strips that are sized for this, or you can just take a sheet of sandpaper and cut what you need. Some advantages to this block are that it's really durable, it's flat, and it's got a little weight to it. When you're sanding, you want flat, even pressure across your sandpaper so that you don't dig trenches as you're sanding. The fact that it has a little weight makes it easier to use. You don't have to push down so hard as you're sanding. The second thing I want to mention is steel wool. Now this is not typically thought of as a sandpaper, but it is an abrasive, and I've got the 4-0s, which is the finest steel wool that they sell. This is great if you need to go over the last coat of your finish and it's completely dried. It'll take down the little dust nibs, and then the way I've used it is if your finish turns out to be too shiny, then you can take it down to the next level with this steel wool. The Orbital Sheet Sand. This is an Orbital Sheet Sander. These are really affordable. I think this was $25 last time I saw these in the store. One of the downsides is they really don't take away a lot of material, so they're not meant for heavy sanding. This is more of a finish sander. Probably the best application is that final sanding before your last coat of polyurethane or clear coat. It's not meant to aggressively sand wood. This spins in a very tight orbital motion, and it's such a tight motion that it almost looks like you're sanding in a straight line, and I'll show you that in a little bit. And because of that, you have to be very careful the grain direction when you're using this sander. It takes quarter sheets of sandpaper, so you can just take a regular sheet, cut it into 4 sections, and you'll have 4 different pieces of sandpaper for this. It's very affordable in that way, and they lock in to the front and the back. For dust collection, this sander has holes on the bottom of the pad, and you really can't see it, but there are channels that go back up in there where the dust is supposed to get sucked in there and into the bag. Now that only works if the sandpaper also has those holes in it. So if you put a sheet of sandpaper on here, you need to either poke the holes or buy sheets of sandpaper that are meant for a sheet sander. I've never bothered with that because this doesn't make enough dust to really affect the project as you're sanding, and then I'm wearing a respirator so it's not affecting my lungs. So the Orbital Sheet Sander is very affordable. It's great for getting into corners, but it's only for very light sanding. I think it's pretty safe to say that the Random Orbit Sander is the most commonly used sander in woodworking today. It's got a good balance of being a smaller tool that's easy to use, but also it can sand pretty aggressively if you put a lower grit sandpaper on it. So the Random Orbit Sander spins, but it also adds a secondary movement that's sort of like an ellipse. Because of this varied movement, you don't have to worry about cutting across the grain or anything like that. You can sand in any direction that you want to. This Random Orbit Sander has hook and loop, which you may know by the brand Velcro, and it comes with little sanding discs that hook on there. So that's very convenient to load and unload. Dust collection is much the same as the Orbital Sheet Sander. It's got holes on the pad and the holes that match on the disc. And dust is sucked up into the bag. And if you pull this bag off, you can put a wet dry vac on, and that suction will obviously be a lot stronger and give you better dust collection. This particular Random Orbit Sander is also a palm sander, so I can use it in one palm, one-handed, and the power button is in much the same position as the sheet sander. If you've got a project and you need to sand to the absolute depths of its soul, you might need a belt sander. These are very aggressive and they're for aggressive projects and not used much in woodworking. I had to use this on the round table build a few months ago because I used really wet wood that moved on me a lot. If you build your project right, let the wood dry, and if your joinery fits right, you shouldn't need the aggressiveness of a belt sander. But if you do need one, they're pretty affordable. There's also a category of benchtop sanders. This one's a 12-inch disc sander that's really no different than the random orbit sander. It spins around in a circle. It just doesn't have the oscillating motion. The great advantage of this is that it has a flat table and the disc itself is flat. So when you bring a workpiece to this sander, you know that you're getting a nice flat and square surface. This one is a combination disc sander. It's just got a smaller disc and then a belt sander. And it's no different than the handheld belt sander I have. It's just stationary. There may be other tools for sanding out there, but those are the ones we're going to cover in this video. So now let's talk about sandpaper. Sandpaper comes in all different shapes and sizes. There's a lot of different kinds of abrasives that are put on sandpaper, but there's some that are minerals, some that are synthetic, and then they put resin on top of that to lock everything in. There's a lot of them like these discs that I showed you specifically fit the random orbit sander. Then there's these 9x11 sheets that can be really cut down into whatever you need. The number that's labeled with the sandpaper is called the grit, and that's just referring to the size of each abrasive on that piece of sandpaper. So the higher the number, the higher the grit, the smaller the abrasives on that sandpaper. So generally around a 100, 120 is a medium grit. Anything below that is more aggressive, and anything above, say, 220 is more of a fine grit or a finishing grit. So let's take that a little further and talk about how to sand correctly. You'll first assess what it is you need to accomplish with your sanding. Do you have some joints that are uneven and you need to sand down one piece or another to get them flush? Do you have a lot of gouges and marks that you need to sand out? Taking a second to figure out exactly what it is you're trying to accomplish will help you decide what grit to start with. If you start with a 60 grit, the next grit you should reach for is a 100 grit, and then a 150, and then you're probably okay to go to a 220, but really you could go to a 180 or a 200, and then a 220. The more incremental steps in between, the better off you're going to be. If you're using an orbital sheet sander or a belt sander or you're hand sanding, you've got to sand with the grain. I put together this quick visual demonstration to show you how each of these sanders are cutting the wood down. The random orbit sander does a really even job, and you can't even really tell if there's any marks at all. The fact that you can't see any tracks or gouges is really a testament to why the random orbit sander is so popular. The one that's hard to wrap your head around is the orbital sheet sander. You would think something that spins in a circle would give sort of swirl marks. But since it is spinning in such a tight orbital motion, it leaves tracks behind. And then the belt sander is not surprising. It's very difficult to get even pressure with a belt sander. And because it is spinning in a forward motion, it leaves a very distinct pattern. All of these are sanding across the grain, and the random orbit sander is the only one we could get away with. The other two just need to be pushed straight up and down with the grain. So by far, the most common mistake made when sanding by beginners and experienced woodworkers is pushing too hard on the sander. You really don't need much pressure at all. You just need enough to keep the sander stable and let the sander do the work. The thought is if the sander's not removing as much wood as you'd like it to, that if you push harder, that the sander will work harder and remove material faster. But that's actually the opposite of what happens. As you push more on the sander, it spins slower. And with the random orbit sander, because you're going to be putting more pressure during certain parts of its pattern, you'll see gouges if you push too hard. So the idea of sanding is not to sand in specific spots. An exception to that is that if you have a joint that is proud of the surface, that just means it protrudes, and you need to aggressively sand that down to get it to about the same level, flush with the rest of the surface. You should always be thinking of giving equal time to the entire surface. One way to help you visualize this is to lightly mark the entire face with a pencil, and that way as you're sanding, if part of the mark has gone away, you know you're done in that area. If you've still got a mark in some areas, then you know you need to hit that again. There's a lot of different thought about how high of a grit you should sand with. If you're applying a stain or just a clear coat, you generally want to have it fairly smooth. Up to 220 is as high as I ever go. Beyond 220, you start to lay the fibers over and it gets really smooth, but that is closing up the pores, so to speak. So the finish can't penetrate down into the wood. So no matter what finish you're doing, whether it be paint or stain or a clear coat, I would not go past 220. Right before I use 220 grit sandpaper, which is always my final grit, it doesn't matter if I've used 4 grits or if 220 is the only one, I put water on the entire surface and then sand with 220 grit sandpaper. And what the water does is excite the fibers in the wood and causes them to raise up. So if you initiate that excitement, then you can sand it down before you start applying finishes. If you don't cause those fibers to raise, they're gonna raise once you start putting your finish on. Last but not least, here's a tip when sanding with plywood. Plywood is made up of really thin sheets of wood that are glued together and they alternate the way the grain faces with every sheet. So if you sand through that thin top layer of wood, it looks really weird. So just know that you can sand plywood a little bit, but don't go too crazy and burn through it. As it goes in a workshop, sanding is really pretty safe. The most dangerous part about it is if you don't wear a respirator and you breathe in those particles. Our lungs were not created to be able to handle an isolated, concentrated area of constant breathing in wood dust. It's just not good for you and it's dangerous. And the big particles that we end up coughing up are bad enough, but really the most dangerous are those tiny particles that your lungs can't evacuate and they get stuck in your lungs for really the rest of your life. So if it's not a respirator or something like an RZ mask that creates an airtight seal, then it's not good enough. So beyond that, there are things like these fan vents. The motor's fan spins right inside there, and you don't want to get your fingers in there. And of course, don't touch the sander while it's spinning. It's not the end of the world. It's not going to cut your finger off, but it doesn't feel good. It can really burn your hand or your fingers. So keep your hands away until it comes to a stop. This has, without a doubt, been the most riveting video you've ever seen on sanding, so thanks for sticking it out with me. Hit the thumbs up, that really helps. Check down below for lots of cool stuff, and I'll see you next time.